Hi everyone, we're back here again, and we are covering the Whelan book, chapters 4 through 5.5, and we are covering correlation and probability and the Monty Hall problem. So let's go ahead and get started. So in terms of correlation, again, usually in this book, when we're going over these concepts, we're trying to figure out what is the importance of a particular stat when you get that in front of you. It's not as important for me to teach you how to get that stat, because I think typically, especially once you start getting into some of these large corporations, you have entire departments dedicated to the people that are finding you those stats. But your job is to be able to recognize and understand those stats. So the power of correlation as a statistical tool is that we can encapsulate an association between two variables in a single descriptive statistic. So that number is a correlation coefficient. It is a single number ranging from either -1 to 1, right? So a perfect positive correlation is a 1. Perfect negative correlation is a -1. If something has a perfect positive correlation, if two things have a perfect positive correlation, that means as one goes up a particular number, this other one goes up by a particular number, and it's exactly the same. As one goes up, the other one goes up. And of course, then it makes sense that if it's a negative correlation, that means as one goes up, the other one goes down to the same degree. The good thing is that there is, jumping ahead here, but zero means there's no meaningful correlation. And that happens from time to time when, again, you jump into these research projects and you make these assumptions and things that you think, these hypotheses that you think are going to happen. And then you run your numbers and then you find out there is no statistical correlation between the two things. That does happen. But the good thing, what I like about correlation coefficient is it has no unit attached to it, right? So, I think in one of the examples they talk about later as the number of TVs and the number in a household goes up, the SAT score gets better, right? There's no unit attached to those two things, but you can still see a correlation between the two. Now, granted, we're going to get into the issues with that particular correlation, but that's an example of how it's just two random units that you can kind of find a correlation between. So the formula for calculating the coefficient does the following. It calculates the mean and standard deviation for both variables. It converts all data so that each observation is represented by its distance from the mean. And most importantly, it does calculate the relationship if there is one. Now, the big thing, and this is what we were just talking about, and this is huge, right? I think a lot of the misinformation that is going out when it comes to studies and research is the correlation. Some folks believe that a correlation does imply causation, and it can lead to a lot of misinformation. But I think the example they provide in the book is really helpful, right? So the fact that they found a correlation between the number of TVs in a household and better SAT scores. Well, I mean, that's true, but there's usually a third variable there, right? So maybe not as much anymore just because TVs are becoming a little bit more affordable, but even so, right? Like, the more TVs you have in your house, that means the bigger your house most likely is, and that usually means you're more financially sound than someone who may only have one television in their home, or someone who doesn't have any televisions in their home. So there is a stronger likelihood that you have more resources to put into your children to make sure that they are succeeding in school, depending on what schools they're going to, after school programs, tutoring. There are a number of other things that are more likely the correlation, that there's a stronger correlation and really the cause for why the SAT scores are going up. And it's not necessarily about the number of TVs that are in that household. Okay. Next we're going to get into is basic probability, right? So this is a study of events and outcomes involving elements of uncertainty. So there's a number of things that people look at here, right? So we have the stock market, gambling, and then my personal favorite is fantasy football. Now, the big thing about basic probability is you're trying to figure out what is likely to happen, right? Given all the information, right? There's no way for us to know the future, so you're trying to figure out the best, like the best case scenario given everything that's going on, what is likely to happen, right? You're trying not to overshoot it. You're not trying to be too overly positive. You're trying to say, based on the information we have, what is most likely to happen. Now, that's not always the case, right? So, I kind of give a little bit of background on fantasy football. You might have a week where one of your players, everything matches up. They're going against a poor defense, or whatever the case may be, and everything sets up where it looks like they're going to have a good week. And then in the first quarter they tweak their ankle and they're out the rest of the game, right? Like things like that are going to happen. But more in terms of leadership and what you should be doing when you're in a position of power with this type of information is you're trying to figure out what is most likely to happen when it comes to the information that you're getting, right? In terms of sales for a particular quarter, in terms of turnover, like that, trying to figure out what is most likely to happen can be beneficial. Now it can also lead to some mistakes, but it is beneficial to understand what that number is all about. I do like the example they gave here because it is something that I think they did a really good job in terms of kind of taking advantage of basic probability, right? Where they did this halftime of the Super Bowl, they did this thing where they got all these 100 Michelob drinkers and wanted to see how many of them would switch over to Schlitz. And they understood that in terms of numbers, it's probably very difficult to tell the difference between the two generic light beers or regular beers. And so they knew that any number, regardless of what the number might be, that switched over, it was probably going to be more than 10 or 20%, would look good, right? As long as any of them are switching over. That means they're showing like, hey, all these people think our beer is better, so you should drink our beer. So that's just one example of a company. And it would be smart for a lot of companies to take advantage of things like that. So again, basic probability explains what is most likely to happen. What is least likely to happen. It can also tell us after the fact what likely happened and what likely did not happen. I think in the book they talked about DNA analysis and the connection between probability and that. Lastly, the last thing I want to go over is the Monty Hall problem because I really do enjoy this one. Right, essentially, for anyone that hasn't seen Let's Make a Deal, typically you choose a door, right? Or a curtain or whatever it might be. There's different variations of this problem, and then there's two other ones, and they'll show you what's behind, door number. You say you choose door number 1, and then they say, okay, we're going to show you what's behind door number 3, and then they'll ask you, do you want to switch? And the argument in the book that they're making, and it checks out. I think they still have the website up where you can just kind of flip through and do the Monty Hall problem online, and you are much more likely to win if you switch your door, right? And the thinking behind that is if you have the option, if someone told you are going to see, essentially you get a 2 out of 3 opportunity to win versus just the 1, you're going to take it. And that's the idea behind that. It's a very simple concept, and they did I think Whelan does a really good job explaining why you should be doing that. But I do find some really strong lessons into kind of what goes on in the mentality of some people. Like, because if you ever watch the show, there's some people like, no, I chose this door. This is my door. And I think this idea of this Monty Hall problem, there's some really good lessons to be learned for anyone that's in a position of power, anybody that's in leadership. So my question is it just a game? Here are some things, right? So we often stick with business decisions that were made when we had less information. Some governments will stay the course despite growing evidence that the course is wrong, right? I think, I think in most situations, right, even when you go to a doctor, right, you might have some sort of illness and they think it's this, and then they'll give you a certain amount of time where they're going to put you on a certain course of medicine. And if it doesn't work, okay, well then it's clearly not this, we're going to switch you to something else, right? Like that's a typical thing. As they learn more about whatever is going on, they're going to switch course. But you see a lot of people, not just governments, but a lot of organizations that just stick with, this is what we're going to do and we're going to stick with it no matter what. Now, it's good to have kind of like that determination, right? Like if you truly do believe this is the way to go. But if you are also given opportunities that are showing you, right, like this is you might have more of an opportunity, you might be able to see more of this particular situation. And additionally, if you're getting information from other sources, right, if you're getting from outside your company or even just other departments, it is not a bad decision to switch course and to jump into something that might be more beneficial to you. So why do people stick with their door? And I think why, kind of like a metaphor for business, right? A lot of us don't like to admit the mistakes that we're making, right? We still want to think, oh, it's no big deal. It's just it's a minor setback, but we're gonna press forward, right? This is a big one. We cling to sunk cost. You see people do this in relationships, right? Well, I've already been with this person for 3 or 4 years. Like, that's a lot of time to put into someone, and just like end a relationship and then move on. It's like, yeah, but are you going to be happy, right? And people do this in business. They'll put a ton of money into a situation and say, well, we put so much time and effort and resources into this, we can't just give up on this now, when all evidence is showing you that you should switch course, you should do something different, or you should just abandon that and move on to something else. Sometimes our judgment is clouded by our need to be goal focused, right? I think it's important to have these goals, but I think it's also important, if anyone's ever taken my leadership communication course, we talk about different goals that we should be having. It's good to have like those big overarching goals, and then there's going to be some minor goals that feed into the larger ones. It's okay to lose sight of some of these smaller goals as long as you're still working underneath that big umbrella, right? If you're still moving forward and making progress, like, it's okay to let go of some of these minor goals, but sometimes it's really tough, especially if it is something that you yourself are very much invested in, right? Like, if it is something that you put a lot of time, effort, and energy into, and everyone is kind of following your lead, it can be really difficult to let that go, right? But it's important to look at the numbers. It's important to look at the information. It's important to listen to the people around you. And a lot of this could just be summed up in the last thing, pride. Right? Oftentimes we just do not want to say that we're wrong. We don't want to say that maybe we should have listened to somebody else. There are a lot of reasons why people don't listen to other people and take advantage of the opportunities to switch things up. So in summary, right, we generally are not good at predicting success, right? If you think about what is it, usually in almost every gambling situation in Vegas, the house is almost always going to win, right? Our information is always imperfect. We're always not going to have all the best possible information available to us. If you look at all those the three main things that we talked about in terms of probability, right? If you think about gambling or the stock market or fantasy sports in general, right, where you're only going to have so much information, right? And this is even more so with this Monty Hall problem, right? Where, like, the only information you have is you have this particular resource, and then these two other possibilities, and one could be really fantastic and one could be absolutely awful, like worst of the three opportunities, right? But you have an opportunity to have two of those things, right? Like, I'm going to grab two of these things instead of just the one, right? So you're still not getting all the information, right? There's still that possibility that you're going to end up with the bum gift, or the bum prize, but that's okay, right? Like, you are trying to do what is statistically best for you and for your company. We tend to stay the course longer than we should in spite of new data, and we don't like to admit our mistakes. And lastly, we sometimes fall into a bravado of a given goal. So these are some of probably my favorite chapters out of the Whelan book. So I hope you enjoyed them as much as I did.